African countries must wake up and recognize that conducting our affairs, political or otherwise, by mimicking Western prescriptions, whether they be from France or the United Kingdom or Portugal or Spain or Italy or any other colonizers, will never take us anywhere. We must remove the cloak of colonization. We must remove the jackets that we borrowed and reclaim our territory by doing everything that defines Africa and Africans in a manner that will allow them to engage with other civilizations from a position of strength. We must revisit the spirit of Modibo Keita. We must revisit the spirit of Samora Moises Machel. We must revisit the spirit of all these great men in order for Africa to occupy her pride of place. Today, when we talk about Pan-Africanism, we remember the leaders who are the pioneers, but we also remember that in the recent past, we have had younger people who have contributed to the spirit of Pan-Africanism. You can name many of them. I've already mentioned Nkrumah, I've talked about Nyerere, I've talked about Modibo, I've talked about Patrice Emery Lumumba, I've talked about Kenneth David Kaunda, I've talked about Samora Machel, and much younger, I've talked about people like Thomas Isidore Sankara. Africa has men and women who now believe that the spirit of Pan-Africanism must be reignited in a different way. And through African institutions, we must now begin to talk about a continent that is no longer ashamed. We must no longer talk about a continent that defines ourselves in the terms of the former colonizers as Anglophone or Lusophone or Francophone. We must only be Afrophone, because it is in that state and from that standpoint that Africa can engage the world from a standpoint of respect, from a standpoint of strength. And recent initiatives, which are Pan-Africanist in character, such as Africa Agenda 2063, must not be allowed to be mere slogans. Things and initiatives such as Africa Continental Free Trade Area must not be allowed to be just initiatives which will be dead on arrival. They must be infused with the spirit of Pan-Africanism, so that Africans within the mother continent and Africans in the diaspora can begin to pull in one direction. I remember so very fondly these words of Malcolm X, when he said that an African anywhere in the world will never ever be respected until the day that the mother continent is respected. And I have no doubt in my mind that what the colonialists tried to erase is now beginning to emerge. History, through the midwifery of people like Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal, now tells us and confirms to us that Africa is the cradle of civilization. History now confirms to us that the spirit of Pan-Africanism must be the tailwind that will push the continent of Africa in the direction that she must go, politically, economically, spiritually, and otherwise. The continent is at a crossroads, and the question is, how do we behave? And I know how. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our institutions. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our minds. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our economies. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our politics. One of the things that we must do now is to decolonize our education. And when we decolonize all those institutions, and when we decolonize our minds, then we can go yonder into the world and tell the world, behold, we are Africans who have no apologies to make, and we can invoke the spirit of the pioneering Pan-Africanists. And there is no shortage of them today who have embraced that spirit. And I have no doubt in my mind that it can be done. Kenya's Ngugi wa Thiong'o has written a book which I commend to anybody who thinks about latter-day Pan-Africanism, decolonization of the mind. Because it is true that when the mind is colonized, then you are going nowhere. When writing in 1950s, Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called Miseducation of the Negro. He was telling the blacks in United States of America that you have been miseducated for too long. And the time now is to re-educate yourself. And I believe that in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we are going to re-educate ourselves. I believe in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we are going to have new initiatives. In the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we are going to give meaning to what Africa stands for, and that is total liberation of her sons and daughters. And when she does that, she is doing that not because she wants to isolate herself from the world, but because she knows that the mother continent is the cradle of all civilization. That is why throughout the ages, in the spirit of Pan-Africanism, we have always been welcoming. So today, let us remind ourselves that our Pan-Africanism is not about building walls around the continent of Africa, but creating bridges in a spirit that will ensure justice, in a spirit that will ensure that we are respected, in a spirit that will ensure that we are sojourners in the world in a manner that will define our future and in a manner that will define humanity. That is the Pan-African spirit. We of the Pan-African persuasion must continue to preach the gospel of Pan-Africanism, but the finer details must only be left to the truly initiated. We must have eyes on both sides of our heads, because it is only then that we will be able to identify those who have launched torpedoes and in this latter day launched missiles and launched drones in order to destroy the continent of Africa and our sons and daughters in the diaspora. It can be done, it must be done, because it has been done before. The spirit of Pan-Africanism is a relay race that started with its founding fathers, W.B. Du Bois and John Sylvester Williams and others, and must be continued to the next generation. It is generation to generation. Pan-Africanism is alive and well. It must also be agile. It must be agile in order to identify our enemies. It must identify those who come in the name of donor aid. Why do they love us so much now that they give us aid? Why do they come now that they tell us how to run our education institutions? Why do they love us now that they tell us how to run our health institutions? Why do they love us now that they tell us how to run our agriculture? Why do they love us now that they tell us how to conduct our politics and to tell us whether we are democratic or not democratic, while they destroyed our Pan-African institution? Not so long ago, I asked myself, does Europe love us so much that they meet us in Lomé, Togo, and have the Lomé Convention to develop our economy? Does Europe love us so much that they create the Cotonou Convention? Does Europe love us so much that they allow us to do certain things, but only for their benefit? The answer is they do not. We as the continent of Africa must always remember that the agenda is to give the continent of Africa a semblance of independence without allowing them to be independent. In other words, the puppeteer is still alive and the puppets are still there, and they do not go out to use anybody. They come from within our ranks. That is why we must always be wary of some within our ranks who are wolves in sheepskin. They are there. They are as dangerous as the colonizers. They are danger to Pan-Africanism. They are danger to Africa. They have always been there. They keep on multiplying. They keep on doing and engaging in their diabolical acts because they know that the spirit of Pan-Africanism cannot be destroyed, but it can be frustrated. And if we understand that, then we'll be able to expose these enemies of Pan-Africanism and deal them a death blow. because that is what must happen to them. You know, when you have an enemy that keeps on changing like the chameleon, you also must have the habits of the chameleon. The African enemies are chameleonic in their behavior. We too must be chameleonic in our desire to survive. We must change how we operate, and changing how we operate means that we change our mindset and change our approaches. I'm told that a good war general does not warn the enemy when they are going to land. They operate in a subterranean way.